Every fear Courage the Cowardly Dog has ever put on screen eventually points back to one thing: not being chased, not being alone, not being changed into something else. The fear underneath all of those fears, the possibility of simply ceasing to exist. A curse that promises doom with no way out. A universe where entire species, entire stars, simply stop existing. A sadness so total, it starts to look like death, wearing a
What's the good of
softer
having all the
name.
money in the world if it doesn't bring any happiness?
This is a deep dive into that fear, the fear of death, and how Courage the Cowardly Dog kept circling back to mortality itself, sometimes literally, sometimes disguised as something else entirely. Before getting into the episodes, it's worth being clear about what makes this fear different from everything else the show explores. This isn't fear of something incomprehensible, or fear of facing a threat alone, or fear of losing someone else. This is the fear of your own ending, the possibility that you, specifically, might simply stop. That fear takes a few different shapes across the series. Sometimes it's doom delivered as supernatural punishment, a sentence with no appeal. Sometimes it's mortality on the largest possible scale, extinction, the death not of one character, but of entire categories of existence. And sometimes it isn't death at all, on paper. It's despair so complete that it starts to function like death, hollowing someone out while they're still technically alive. The thread underneath all of it is the oldest fear there is. Not pain, not loss of someone else. The end of yourself. Total, final, and something no amount of cleverness can negotiate its way out of. Let's start with the most direct expression of this fear in the whole series: doom, delivered as supernatural punishment with no negotiation attached. King Ramses' Curse. The curse in this episode isn't just a threat of harm, it's a promise of doom, a fate that's already been decided, activated by rules nobody currently involved fully understands or agreed to. That's what separates doom from ordinary danger. Danger implies you might survive it. Doom implies the outcome was already decided the moment the curse was triggered, and everything after that point is just delay. There's no villain to reason with here. Courage isn't trying to defeat death in this episode. He's trying to buy time against it, which is its own quiet acknowledgement that some fears can't actually be defeated, only postponed. That's the fear of death in its most ancient form. A sentence with no appeal, and a hero whose only real weapon is refusing to stop trying, even when the ending was never really in question. Now scale this fear up, from one family's curse to something closer to the size of the universe. Last of the Starmakers. This episode deals with extinction and mortality directly, not the death of a single character, but the death of an entire category of existence. Species, things that were once numerous and are now nearly gone. That's a different flavor of mortality dread than a personal curse. It's not you might die, it's the entire kind of thing you are might not exist much longer. There's something particularly unsettling about mortality at this scale, because it removes the comfort of feeling like an exception. A curse can feel personal, even unfair, in a way that at least implies you mattered enough to be targeted. Extinction doesn't target anyone, it just proceeds. This is fear of death at the scale of a species instead of a self. And it's arguably the most philosophically heavy idea the show ever puts in front of a young audience, that even survival isn't guaranteed to matter if there's eventually no one left to remember what survived. Finally, there's a version of this fear that never actually says the word death out loud, but circles it closely enough to count. The Tower of Dr. Zalost. Zalost Tower deals with emotional despair, but despair pushed far enough that it starts to function like death, while the person experiencing it is still technically alive. That's a genuinely unsettling variation on mortality fear, because it doesn't require anyone to stop breathing. It just requires hope, motivation, and the will to keep going, to be drained out of someone until what's left barely resembles a person who wants to be alive. This is where fear of death gets its quietest, most psychological expression in the entire series. Not a curse, not extinction, just despair, allowed to go far enough that it starts to look like the thing everyone's actually afraid of, without ever technically becoming it. Courage's fear here isn't fighting off a monster. It's refusing to let despair finish what it's threatening to do, which might be the closest this entire series gets to treating death as something that can creep in quietly, rather than arrive all at once. Step back for a second and consider why this particular fear sits underneath so much of what the show does. A curse is frightening because it might kill you. Isolation is frightening partly because if something goes wrong, there's no one there to help you survive it. Loss is frightening because it previews, through someone else, what your own ending might eventually look like. Even transformation carries a version of this fear, the worry that whatever you become might not really be you anymore, which is its own quiet cousin of dying. Death doesn't need its own episode to be present. It's the quiet floor underneath almost every other fear the show has ever explored, the reason any of those other threats matter in the first place. That's what makes King Ramses' Curse, last of the Starmakers, the Tower of Dr. Zalost, such an important trio. Together, they show mortality at 3 different scales: personal doom, cosmic extinction, psychological erasure. 3 sizes of the exact same fear. Across these 3 episodes, Courage the Cowardly Dog finally shows its hand. Every curse survived, every isolated night endured, every loss grieved, every transformation reversed. All of it was always in service of the same fear, not dying, or, when dying isn't avoidable, not disappearing without having mattered to someone. Courage never really defeats this fear. Nobody does. He just keeps showing up against it, which might be the truest definition of courage the show ever offers. Not the absence of fear, just refusing to let it be the last word.